a different academic background, but you realize that you have important questions in common. And so we started looking for ways to test some of our ideas. And fortunately for us, there's a fantastic study that was right down the road from us, the Framingham Heart Study. I think some of you in this room are probably already familiar with it. This is a study that started in the late 1940s. They had people come in for doctor's visits every 2 to 4 years. They had them fill out social surveys, took all kinds of information about them from the doctor's visit, where you got objective information about their health status. And they kept coming back year after year after year. In fact, they started following the children of this cohort in the early 1970s, and they started following the grandchildren of the cohort in the early 2000s. So it's about 15,000 people total in the study. And what's truly remarkable is that they've managed to keep people coming back year after year. And we discovered that the reason they were able to do this is because they were asking patients to give them their lists. They were asking people to name where they lived, so they knew where the neighbors were, asked them where they worked, so they knew who the co-workers were. They even asked them to name a close friend. And when we discovered that they had this information, we realized we were going to be able to create these maps over the course of the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and on into the future. And when we started doing that, thanks to funding from the National Institute on Aging, we started making maps that looked like this. Again, each circle is a person, each line is a relationship. We actually have different colors for the lines depending on whether or not you have a genetic relationship, your family member, or a non-genetic relationship, say a spouse or a friend. And we can also start putting information in the circles. And in this case, we wanted to put the information in the circles that would help us to answer an interesting question. Is the obesity epidemic literally an epidemic? Not in the sense that people are increasing in the incidence of obesity, but in the sense that obesity can spread from person to person to person, like the flu. And I don't mean by that fat flies off of me and sticks to you. What I mean is, I have behaviors that cause me to become obese, and I may transmit those behaviors to you. You may imitate them. You may get information from me that helps to support your behaviors. Or you may come to think that I have an idea of what's appropriate, and so you also have an idea about what's appropriate, and you fit your behaviors to match that social norm. And so what we need to do is we need to see whether or not there's evidence of this kind of spreading behavior in these networks. And when we did that, we looked at the map, and what we discovered was that if we put certain information there, we could see visually that there were these clusters of behavior. In this case, we made the circle sizes proportional to body mass index. So larger nodes are literally larger people. And we colored the nodes greater than 30 of body mass index yellow, and that's the official definition for obesity. And we discovered that there were clusters, and we could statistically characterize them. If I don't know anything about you, but I know that you are a member of the Framingham Heart Study, and I know that your friend is obese, then I have a lot of information that helps me to predict whether or not you're obese. In fact, your risk of obesity is 40% higher than it would be if that friend wasn't obese. If your friend's friend is obese, it increases your risk of obesity by 20%. And if your friend's friend's friend is obese, it increases your risk of obesity by 10%. And beyond 3 degrees of separation, the effects tended to go to 0. And so this is exactly what you would expect to find if there was some kind of spreading process in the network. But that's not the only thing that can explain these clusters. We want to know whether or not one person's behavior is changing in another and another, like dominoes fall. We want to know if this is influence. But there's another possibility, and that is that people are choosing friends who are like them. So sociologists call this homophily. It's one of my favorite words. It's a word that literally means love of like. It's this idea that birds of a feather flock together. That bird didn't make the other bird look that way. They started flying together because they were a similar type. So some of what we're seeing may be due to that rather than due to influence. We also have to contend with the problem that there are things going on in the environment that affect both of us that have nothing to do with the friendship. So a gym may open up in our neighborhood, and my friend and I might both join independently and start going, and our weight declines. And in other neighborhoods where the gym doesn't open up, their weight may be going up. And so that's another reason why you might see this kind of clustering in networks. And so it's a really tricky problem to try to figure out how much of this is due to each one of these different factors. Now, fortunately for us, we had 32 years of data to work with. We had information not just about people's body mass, but also about their networks. And let me put these networks into motion for you. So the year shows you the year that we took these snapshots of the network, and you'll see two circles coming together as a relationship forms, or two circles flying apart. Two people might get divorced, for example. And importantly, that means that not only are they disconnected, but the friends are disconnected as well. But starting in the 1980s, what you'll notice is that the circles are getting larger and larger and larger over time, consistent with what was going on in the rest of the country. We were going from an incidence of obesity from about 10% to an incidence well over 30%. And the thing about having this kind of overtime information is that we can now try to think of creative ways to control for that tendency to choose friends who are like us, or to try to see whether or not context was driving the results. So the first thing that we did is we actually divided up the friendships in order to see whether or not different kinds of people influence one another. And we based this on a very unfortunate fact. On your lists, some of you in this room, if I were to ask those people to name their lists, some of them wouldn't name you back. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. I was that way when I was growing up. And as a consequence, we now have an asymmetric relationship that has power to help us detect differences. If I think of you as a friend, and I remember you enough to put you on my list, but you don't remember me enough to put me on your list, then that means if there's some change that happens to you, it should affect me in the future, but not vice versa, on average. And if we both name one another, those are the strongest relationships, and we would expect the effects to be strongest. And that's exactly what we see. If someone on your list becomes obese, it increases your risk of obesity in the next 2 to 4 years by about 57%, and that's net of controls. If you look in the opposite direction, you named them, but they didn't name you back. If you become obese, it has no effect on them whatsoever. If you mutually name one of those friends, and they become obese, it triples your risk of obesity. So this is an observational study. There are still problems that we're working on in terms of trying to figure out how much of this is influenced, but this is suggestive that we have an effect in one direction and not in the other direction. We also have this result where we were able to look at the immediate neighbors of people in this study. And what we found was that when my next door neighbor becomes obese, it has no effect on me whatsoever. So this means, first of all, that it's probably not context that's driving the result. And second of all, it means that it's the deep, close social relationships that matter. You're not going to catch obesity by sitting next to someone on the bus. Believe me, that's the way the media reacted to this study. And some of you know what I'm talking about. So this is really important to understand that these effects that we're seeing, they're between the real world social ties, not between these incidental social ties that are not very deep. After this study, we actually started looking at other outcomes like smoking. Smoking is an interesting example because it's the reverse of the obesity epidemic. We started with an incidence of about 40% and went down to an incidence of about 10%. And you can see here that going between the two diagrams, here we made the circles proportional to cigarette smoking, they decreased dramatically. But here we found something different from the obesity study. Although it was true that my smoking behavior was correlated with the smoking behavior of my friend's friend's friend, it also appears that the smoking behavior had an effect on the network itself. In fact, what we found was that starting in the 1980s, smokers started getting pushed to the outside of their social networks. So while we were making people who could quit physically healthier, we were making people who could not quit socially less healthy. And I'm not sure that we had adequately taken into account the negative consequences of some of these social pressure campaigns that surely contributed to some of this effect. And we wouldn't know about this if we didn't study the social network itself to be able to understand how this connectivity changes as a result of these different kinds of outcomes. We also studied drinking behavior. It's not going to surprise you to find out that in the Framingham Heart Study, men are more likely to drink heavily than women. But it may surprise you to find out that when men quit drinking, no one cares. We found in these networks clusters that extended 3 degrees of separation, but men had nothing to do with them. It was all driven by women. Now think about that for just a second. There's a counterintuitive implication. If you want men to quit drinking heavily, maybe you would do better by treating the women. The men are susceptible, but the women are influential. And you wouldn't know that if you didn't have the network ties. that sometimes you have an opportunity to get a bigger bang for your buck by treating not the person who's going to get the disease, but the person who can help to prevent the disease. And we see this in other network studies as well. So we kept finding this 3 degrees result, not just in the Framingham Heart Study, also in the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. That was in teenagers. There we found that the effects clustered out to 4 degrees of separation to your friends, 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 friends. And then we started to think about, well, what is the source of these behaviors that are spreading through the network? And so we turned to psychology. And psychology is full of nice laboratory studies that show you that emotions are contagious. We were trying to explain this to a reporter from the New York Times. We said to him, it's like when you're walking down the street and you see someone smile, you can't help but smile back. And the reporter said, oh, we don't do that in New York. Nonetheless, in other parts of the country, this has been documented by psychologists. And so we went back to the Framingham Heart Study, and we looked to see what happens to long-term happiness. And here we colored the circles yellow for people who were happy, and blue for people who were sad. Get it? Blue, sad? Yeah. And here, once again, we find these 3 degrees clusters. If I don't know anything about you, but I know that your friend's happy, then I can do better than chance at saying that you yourself are happy as well. And in this case, one interesting thing is that we found that there was this result that was consistent with something that economists have found. When you win the lottery, economists have discovered, you're happier the next day. But after about a year, you go back to being just as miserable as you were before. And we found the same thing true in Framingham. If you have a friend who becomes happy, it increases the likelihood that you're happy for about a year, but then you go back to your baseline level of happiness. So that's something that's different from these behaviors. The behaviors tend to persist. The emotions, they tend to be fleeting, and you return to your baseline state. Now, we also started thinking about, well, these are observational studies. We know it's very difficult to tease out effects. Correlation is not causation. We have to do our best, but it's never going to be a pure thing. And so we started doing experiments. So this is one experiment where we had people engage in a public goods game. This is what economists use to measure generosity. So you can imagine what you would do if I put you in this game. I put you with a group of 3 other people, so there's 4 of you. Each of you gets $10, and each of you has to decide how much money to give to a group project. I'm going to multiply that amount of money, but the amount that I multiply it by is not going to be enough to make economic sense for you to contribute to it. Okay, so it's only going to go up by 1.5, and so it's going to cost you more to give to it than you're going to give out for each dollar you donate. Now, economists are stunned to find out that anyone ever gives anything, because their model of human behavior up until recently has been that human beings are purely self-interested. But people do tend to give money in this game. People do tend to show generosity, and that generosity can be affected by what they see other people do. We put people in networks where we had people play this game of 4 with 4 people, and then they played another game of 4 with a different group of people, and another game of 4 with a different group of people, so that we could see how you being randomly assigned to one person affects your behavior in the next round, and also affects the behavior of the people that you play with in the next round, and so on. And what we discovered was that there are generosity cascades that extend to 3 degrees of separation. If I give $1 more in the first round of this game, and you're playing with me, you are going to give 20 cents more in the next round. And in the round after that, the people that you play with are going to give 8 cents more. And in the round after that, the people they play with are going to give 5 cents more. And I know that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but it adds up because 3 becomes 9 becomes 27. It's the power of exponential numbers. And when we added up the size of all those effects, what we discovered is every extra dollar of giving in the first round of this game yielded an additional $3 in giving by everybody else in the network. In other words, the network acts like a matching grant. And it is this power that we seek to exploit as we're trying to think of ways that we can intervene in these networks in order to multiply the effects of our interventions to make people healthier, happier, and more generous. Now, we saw this 3 degrees of separation thing all over the place, and we started thinking, is this something that's